The pavement was wet from a late summer storm, the kind that leaves steam rising off the asphalt as the sun fights its way back through the clouds. It was late afternoon in Greenville, North Carolina, a quiet suburban stretch where the hum of traffic blended with the sound of cicadas and the faint rhythm of a basketball dribbling on the corner court. Jalen Lawson, 17, tall and lean with a backpack slung over one shoulder, had just finished basketball practice at his high school gym. He was walking home, earbuds in, hoodie half-zipped, the faint buzz of a Kendrick Lamar track barely audible to anyone but him. He wasn't thinking about danger. He was thinking about the essay he had due Monday, about college applications, about dinner waiting at home. But that calm was shattered by the flash of red and blue. A black and white cruiser rolled up beside him, slow, deliberate. The passenger window slid down and a voice barked through the humid air. "Hey, you stop right there," Jalen froze. The officer who stepped out was tall, square-shouldered, and wearing an expression that said he'd already made up his mind. Officer Brian Keller, his partner Todd Mason, followed, hand resting casually on his belt. Neither smiled. Neither explained. "What's your name?" Keller demanded. "Jalen," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Jalen Lawson. You live around here?" "Yes, sir." "Right over on Magnolia Street." Keller's eyes narrowed. "Magnolia? You mean those new houses past the park? Who you visiting over there?" "My family," Jalen replied, confusion mixing with caution. "We moved there last year." Mason circled behind him, scanning his backpack. "What's in the bag?" "My school stuff. Just got out of practice." Keller's tone sharpened. "Mind if we take a look?" Jalen hesitated. "Do I have to?" That was enough. Keller stepped closer, his voice now louder. "I asked you a question. Don't get smart." Before Jalen could respond, Keller grabbed the strap of his backpack and yanked it open. Books spilled onto the sidewalk. A pair of sneakers hit the ground. Nothing but notebooks, a basketball jersey, and a half-eaten granola bar. Mason muttered, "Always something with these kids." Jalen's pulse quickened. He bent down to pick up his things, but Keller's boot came down on a notebook. "Don't move," the officer snapped. That's when the second cruiser pulled up, another unit responding to a call Keller had never actually made. The dispatcher had flagged their car because the GPS showed them idle too long. A neighbor, curious from her porch, started filming. "What's going on?" she called. "Police business," Keller said sharply. "Go back inside." But she didn't. Her name was Laura Mitchelson, a local middle school teacher who recognized Jalen instantly. She'd seen him play in the regional finals 2 months earlier. Honor roll kid, captain of the team, quiet, respectful. The last person she'd ever imagine in trouble. "Officers," she said carefully. "That's Jalen Lawson. He's one of my students." Keller's eyes flicked toward her. "Ma'am, please step away from the scene." "This isn't a scene," she said firmly. "He's a kid walking home." But before her words landed, Mason grabbed Jalen's arm. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "What?" "Why, I didn't do anything. Stop resisting. I'm not." And that's when Keller shoved him. Hard. Jalen stumbled forward, palms scraping the curb, earbuds tearing free. Mason twisted his wrist, forcing him down. Keller's knee came down on his back, the crack of contact echoing louder than it should have. Jalen gasped, breath caught between pain and disbelief. "Please, stop fighting," Keller shouted, though Jalen wasn't fighting at all. He was pinned, face pressed to wet concrete, the world spinning in a blur of sirens and fear. Across the street, Laura's voice trembled as she spoke into her phone. "He's a student. He's just a student. They're hurting him." She wasn't the only one recording now. 2 bystanders had pulled out their phones. Another, Tyrone Ellis, a mechanic who lived nearby, muttered, "Not again," and crossed the street despite Keller barking at him to stay back. "Hey man, you can't do that to a kid," Tyrone shouted. "He's down." "He's not moving." Mason turned, hand on his taser. "Step back or you'll be next." But the crowd was growing. A grocery clerk, a jogger, a woman walking her dog, they all stopped, phones up, disbelief written across their faces. Then amid the chaos, Jalen whispered the words that would change everything. "Call my dad." Keller leaned closer. "What did you say?" Jalen's voice cracked, but he forced the words out again. "Call my dad," Keller sneered. "Yeah, sure." "What's he gonna do?" Jalen spat out dirt, his cheek pressed against the curb. "He's the Attorney General." Keller froze. For a moment, even Mason stopped moving. The tension between them thickened, but Keller recovered fast. "Nice try," he said. "Heard that one before." But Tyrone, still filming, zoomed in on Jalen's face. "Say it again, kid." "My dad's Charles Lawson," Jalen said, barely able to lift his head. "State Attorney General." And that's when the world shifted. Laura lowered her phone slightly, eyes wide. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He's telling the truth." Because everyone in North Carolina knew the name Charles Lawson, the first black attorney general in the state's history, a man whose face had appeared on every news channel just months earlier after he led a civil rights investigation into police reform. Keller's confidence faltered. He looked down at the teen he'd just slammed into the concrete. His knee was still on Jalen's back. Slowly, awkwardly, he lifted it, but it was too late. Laura was already live on Facebook. Tyrone's video was streaming on TikTok. In less than 5 minutes, thousands of people across the city were watching. Jalen lay there, bruised and bleeding from a split lip, while Keller radioed for backup, his voice shaking now. "Dispatch a possible misidentification requesting supervisor on site." "Copy," the dispatcher replied. "Supervisor en route." Keller looked down again. "You got any ID on you?" "It's in my bag," Jalen muttered. "You threw it." Mason crouched, rifling through the soaked contents until he found a student ID card. He froze when he saw the name. Keller snatched it. His jaw clenched. The ID read, Jalen C. Lawson, Greenville High School, Charles Lawson's son. Keller's face drained of color. And then, as if on cue, every phone around them began buzzing at once. Notifications flooded screens. Breaking news. Video emerges of teen assaulted by Greenville police. Attorney General's office responds, because Denise Lawson had just called her husband. And within minutes, the situation on that suburban corner had become a national headline. Charles Lawson was in Raleigh, finishing a meeting with civil rights attorneys when his phone rang. The moment he heard his wife's voice, calm but trembling, his expression changed. "They're hurting Jalen," she said. "Right now. The video's online." He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply stood, nodded once to his chief of staff and said, "Get me the Greenville police chief on the line. Now." Back on Magnolia Street, Keller's radio crackled. "Unit 47, stand down immediately. Chief Donovan is en route. Do not engage further." It wasn't a request. Keller swallowed hard. Mason stepped back completely, hands raised as if to prove he wasn't part of it. Tyrone Ellis kept filming. "Now you quiet, huh?" he said under his breath. "Keep that same energy." Laura knelt beside Jalen as Keller finally stepped away. "You okay?" she whispered. "My ribs," he said softly. She reached out but stopped, afraid to cause more pain. "Your dad's on his way," she said. And for the first time since it began, Jalen exhaled. By the time the black SUVs arrived unmarked but unmistakable, the street was lined with onlookers. Uniformed officers formed a shaky perimeter. Captain Rick Donovan stepped out first, face tight, knowing exactly who was about to step out of the second vehicle. Charles Lawson, 6'1", tailored suit, quiet authority that made every uniform straighten instinctively. He walked past them without a word, his eyes fixed on his son sitting on the curb, jacket over his shoulders, face bruised but alive. He crouched down. "You all right, son?" Jalen nodded weakly. "Yeah." Charles brushed the dirt from his cheek. His voice was calm, but underneath it was something colder than anger control sharpened by years of courtroom precision. Then he stood and faced the officers. "Which one of you touched my boy?" No one spoke. Keller swallowed, his voice small now. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding." Charles's eyes locked on him. "You're Officer Keller?" "Yes, sir." "Then you'll speak to my office with counsel present. Until then, you are relieved of duty." Donovan started to intervene. "Mr. Attorney General, perhaps we could—" Charles didn't raise his voice. "Captain, I will be filing formal charges before sunset. You will treat this scene as an active investigation into assault and unlawful detention, or your badge will be next." The crowd was silent. The power dynamic had flipped so fast it left the air humming. Keller's hands shook. Mason looked like he wanted to disappear. Denise arrived minutes later, eyes red, holding Jalen's hand as paramedics examined him. "Mom, I'm okay," he said, but his voice broke on the last word. Charles turned toward Tyrone and Laura, who were still filming. "Don't stop," he said quietly. "The truth needs witnesses." And they didn't. Within hours, the footage dominated every network feed. Attorney General's son assaulted by police officers in Greenville. The clip showed Keller's knee on Jalen's back, the disbelief of the bystanders. The moment the name Lawson dropped like thunder. By nightfall, Keller and Mason were suspended without pay. The Greenville PD issued a statement calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the Attorney General's office called it something else, a violation of civil and constitutional rights. In the days that followed, everything the department thought it could control began unraveling. Charles Lawson didn't just demand accountability, he brought it, step by step, in the same way his son had endured the assault. Without rage, without chaos, but with unstoppable precision. He called for a statewide audit of use of force incidents. He froze pending promotions. He issued subpoenas for body cam footage the department had never released before. And as reporters camped outside Greenville PD, Keller sat alone in his house watching his own face replayed on national television, the knee on a teenager's back haunting him in every frame. But the real story wasn't over. It was just beginning, because when Jalen finally spoke publicly for the first time a week later, from the steps of the courthouse, his words changed everything. He said quietly, "I didn't think it would happen to me, but it did, and that's the point." Reporters fell silent. Charles stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, no podium, no script, just truth. And across America, that moment became the spark for something larger than a headline. The video didn't fade like most viral clips. It multiplied. Every network replayed the same frame, the blacktop glistening under summer sun, a teenager's cheek pressed against the ground, and the words, "He's the Attorney General's son," echoing over muffled gasps. Within 24 hours, it was everywhere. Local news anchors tried to sound calm. National commentators called it a turning point. Protesters filled the courthouse steps holding signs that read "Justice for Jalen." Others just held their phones, replaying the clip in disbelief. Charles Lawson didn't give a press conference. He gave orders. His communications team stayed silent while he moved behind the scenes. Internal Affairs was activated before dawn. The officers' body cameras were seized. The department's network access was frozen under state authority. It was the first time in state history that a local precinct had been locked down by the Attorney General's directive. At the same time, Denise Lawson sat at her son's bedside in the hospital. The bruises were fading, but the silence between them was heavy. Jalen stared at the ceiling. "I didn't even do anything," he said softly. Denise squeezed his hand. "You shouldn't have to." Across town, Keller and Mason sat in separate interrogation rooms. Their union representative tried to keep them calm, but both men knew it was useless. Keller's voice was small. "It got out of hand," he muttered. "We thought he fit the description." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Description of what?" Keller hesitated. "A burglary suspect. Tall black male, gray hoodie." The investigator's tone was flat. "Half the teenagers in this county wear gray hoodies. The more they talked, the worse it looked. Dispatch logs showed no active burglary call. Their own dash cam proved they had stopped Jalen without cause." Mason's microphone captured Keller saying, "He doesn't look like he lives there." It was enough to end careers and start a statewide reckoning. Meanwhile, Jalen's name became a symbol. High school teammates wore patches with the initials JL. Local pastors organized vigils. On social media, the hashtag #WalkHomeSafe trended for days. But Jalen didn't want fame. He wanted quiet. "They only see what happened on the street," he told his mother. "They don't see what happens after the looks, the questions." Denise brushed his hair back. "Then we'll show them what happens after. On our terms." Charles spent nights drafting reform orders at the kitchen table. He was methodical, not theatrical. "We're not making a statement," he told his deputies. "We're making precedent." He proposed mandatory de-escalation retraining, independent complaint boards, and a statewide public database of disciplinary records. Law enforcement lobbyists called it overreach. He called it overdue. When the grand jury convened, the courtroom was packed. Keller and Mason sat at the defense table, pale under fluorescent lights. The prosecutor presented the footage frame by frame. Each pause felt like a hammer strike. The jury foreman's voice was steady when he read the decision. Indictment approved. Keller was charged with aggravated assault and falsifying reports. Mason with accessory misconduct. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Charles stepped to the microphones only once. "This is not revenge," he said. "This is responsibility." Jalen listened from home, the sound low on the television. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. "It's weird," he said to his friend Terrence Allen. "Everyone says justice, but it doesn't feel like winning." Terrence nodded. "That's because justice isn't winning. It's starting over." In the months that followed, hearings stretched on. Keller's defense tried to claim stress, confusion, procedural errors. The video undercut every word. The verdict came on a gray morning in March, guilty on both counts. Mason took a plea deal and cooperated. Keller was sentenced to 5 years, eligible for parole in 2. He stared straight ahead as the judge spoke, the same blank stare he'd worn the day he pinned a kid to the pavement. Outside the courthouse, Charles found no satisfaction. Reporters crowded him, asking if this was closure. "Closure isn't the goal," he said. "Change is," and change came slow but undeniable. The Greenville Police Department adopted new oversight measures. Officers attended bias training led by community panels. For the first time, citizens were invited into review meetings once reserved for command staff. The reforms spread beyond the county. Other cities quietly copied the model. A year later, Jalen walked into his graduation ceremony. The applause that followed wasn't just for grades or trophies. It was for survival. As he crossed the stage, he caught sight of his parents in the crowd, Denise wiping a tear. Charles standing tall but proud in the way only a father who'd nearly lost his son could be. After the ceremony, a young reporter approached Jalen for comment. He hesitated, then said simply, "I learned that respect isn't something you're given. It's something you demand by staying standing, even after they try to put you down." The quote would headline half the country's papers the next day. That night, the Lawsons sat on the porch as the neighborhood kids rode by on bikes. For once, the street was quiet. Jalen leaned back, the faint glow of his phone screen reflecting on his face. He'd received hundreds of messages from other teens, some scared, some thankful. He didn't reply to all of them, just one. "Keep walking home." Charles looked at his son. "You change more than you realize." Jalen shook his head. "You did," Charles smiled faintly. "We both did." The cicadas started again, louder this time, blending with the hum of summer night. The world outside was still imperfect, still unpredictable, but something fundamental had shifted. Because one call from a father hadn't just saved a son, it had forced an entire system to look in the mirror. And when the reflection stared back, for once it didn't turn away. 2 years passed, and the city learned to breathe differently. The corner of Magnolia Street where it had all begun was no longer a place people hurried past. Someone had set a small bronze plaque into the sidewalk for everyone who just wanted to walk home. People left flowers there sometimes. Local students on field trips pointed it out quietly, as if it were part of history instead of the street they lived on. The Lawsons had settled into a new rhythm. Charles still worked long hours, but he had stopped bringing files to the dinner table. Denise returned to teaching part-time, determined to remind her students that fairness wasn't a subject, it was a habit. Jalen was in his first year of college, studying political science. He joked that he was the only freshman whose first lesson in civics had come in handcuffs. But underneath the humor there was a seriousness that hadn't been there before. Then one spring afternoon, an official letter arrived from the Department of Corrections. Keller had applied for early parole. The hearing was public. Charles laid the paper on the kitchen counter without comment. Denise looked at it, then at him. "Are you going?" He didn't answer immediately. Jalen, standing in the doorway, said quietly, "I want to." The hearing was held in a small courtroom in Raleigh. No cameras this time. No crowd, just a handful of officials. Keller's attorney and a few members of the Lawson family sitting in the back row. Keller looked older, smaller somehow. His hair was grayer, his uniform replaced by a plain jumpsuit. When asked to speak, he cleared his throat. "I made decisions that hurt people," he said. "I told myself I was following training, but the truth is I was following fear." His eyes flicked toward Jalen. "I can't take back what I did, but I can carry it honestly for the rest of my life." When it was over, the board granted parole. Some in the room frowned, others nodded. Jalen didn't move. Outside, reporters waited, hoping for a soundbite. Charles stopped them with a raised hand. "No statements," he said. "This isn't about vengeance." Later that evening, Jalen sat on the steps of his dorm, watching the sun drop behind the library. A message appeared on his phone from an unknown number. It read, "I know sorry isn't enough, but it's a start, BK." He didn't reply. He just stared at the words until the screen went dark. That fall, he interned in his father's office. He sat in on policy meetings, watched how laws began as ideas and became arguments, and how those arguments, if they were lucky, turned into rules that could protect someone else. When one of the staffers asked what drew him to public service, he answered simply, "Because I know what happens when the system forgets it's supposed to serve." By the third anniversary of the incident, the reforms Charles had written were law. Every officer in the state now wore cameras that could not be deactivated in the field. All complaints were logged publicly. Community review boards had equal voting power with command staff on disciplinary actions. The same precinct that once refused accountability now hosted monthly town halls. Sometimes Jalen attended quietly, sitting in the back. On one of those evenings, an older officer spoke during the Q&A. "We used to think transparency made us weak," he said. "Turns out it's the only thing that keeps us strong." The room was silent for a moment before people began to clap, not for the man, but for the idea that maybe the world could learn. Afterward, Jalen stepped outside. The air was cool, and for the first time in years, the sound of sirens in the distance didn't make his heart race. He walked home alone, the same way he had that day, except now every step felt claimed, owned, safe. Back in Raleigh, Charles drafted one last memorandum before resigning to run for governor. In it, he wrote, "Justice is not an event. It's maintenance. When we stop tending to it, it rusts." He left it unsigned on purpose so it would belong to anyone who needed to read it. Denise framed the first newspaper clipping of the case and hung it beside Jalen's college acceptance letter. Beneath it, she wrote in her neat teacher's handwriting, "Never again, just a headline." Years later, when people asked Jalen about that summer afternoon, he didn't talk about fear or pain. He talked about the crowd, about the neighbor who filmed, the teacher who spoke up, the strangers who stopped walking. "That's what saved me," he said. "Not power, people." And that became the quiet legacy of the Lawson family. Not a scandal, not revenge, but the reminder that decency is contagious if you let it be. So if you ever pass through Greenville and see that plaque on Magnolia Street, stop for a moment. You don't need to take a picture or post a clip. Just remember why it's there. Because one boy's walk home forced a city to wake up, and that awakening never went back to sleep. The national reaction was immediate, and for once it wasn't divided. News anchors who normally filled airtime with noise spoke in careful tones. Morning shows opened with the footage of Jalen on the pavement, and by evening the clip had become the shorthand for a crisis. Editorials asked what it meant when even the son of the state's highest legal officer wasn't safe from suspicion. Talk radio callers argued about policy, fear, and fairness. But beneath all the noise, something quieter started, a question whispered across kitchen tables and classrooms. If this could happen to him, what chance did anyone else have? Charles Lawson didn't watch the coverage. He lived it. Every day after the incident, his office phone rang with calls from other parents whose children had been stopped, questioned, or pushed without reason. He listened one by one and took notes in a neat hand on yellow legal pads. He told his staff, "These aren't stories. They're data. We build reform on data." And so they did. The Attorney General's team became an engine of accountability. They requested every stop report filed in the last 10 years. They mapped patterns, neighborhoods, officers, outcomes. The picture that emerged was impossible to deny. Race had become a shortcut for suspicion. Meanwhile, in Greenville, the mayor held a press conference outside City Hall. His voice trembled as he read from a prepared statement. "We acknowledge the actions taken by Officers Keller and Mason were unacceptable and contrary to our values." Reporters shouted questions, but he kept repeating the same line until the microphones drowned him out. Behind him, the police chief stood stiff and silent, aware that his own job might not last the week. Inside the department, panic spread like wildfire. Some officers deleted old text chains. Others whispered about transferring to neighboring counties before the investigation reached them. But not everyone hid. A few younger officers, those who'd joined believing the badge could mean something. Honest came forward with statements, internal reports, evidence of misconduct that had been buried for years. One said quietly to investigators, "We were told to stop the kids who looked like they didn't belong." Nobody said the words, but everyone knew what they meant. Those testimonies changed everything. At home, Jalen tried to return to normal. School reopened after the summer break, and walking through the hallways felt different now. Some kids looked at him like a celebrity, others with pity. Teachers hesitated before calling on him in class. He didn't blame them. He'd become more symbol than student. The counselor suggested time off, but Jalen refused. "If I leave," he said, "then they win twice." Denise drove him every morning, waiting until he walked through the doors before pulling away. Each day she replayed the same thought. He's alive, he's alive, he's alive. Gratitude and fury lived side by side in her chest. Charles worked quietly. He avoided interviews, avoided theatrics. His reform bills moved through committees with precision. When a senator complained that his measures were anti-police, Charles replied calmly, "They're anti-abuse." There's a difference. It was the kind of line that reporters loved, and it spread faster than any speech. But power always pushes back. Police unions called him a traitor. Anonymous messages arrived at his office, thinly veiled threats, some mocking, some angry. Charles refused extra security until Denise insisted. "You protect everyone else," she said. "Let someone protect you." He finally agreed. One evening, Jalen walked into his father's office at home. Charles was staring at a stack of letters on his desk. "They want me to testify before Congress," he said quietly. "About national policing standards." Jalen hesitated, then asked, "Will you?" Charles looked up. "I will." Then he paused. "You coming with me?" The hearing was held in Washington, under the bright lights of the national press. The committee chair introduced Charles as a man whose courage comes from loss, not ambition. Cameras clicked as he took his seat. He didn't bring lawyers or aides, just a single folder of documents and his son sitting quietly behind him. When asked to explain the reforms he wanted, Charles didn't speak in legal terms. He spoke like a father. "My child did everything we tell our kids to do. He was respectful, he complied, he didn't run. And he still ended up on the ground. That's not a bad apple problem. That's a system problem." The room went still. Even the senators who had planned to grandstand kept their questions short. By the time the hearing ended, Charles had become more than a state official. He had become a national voice. News anchors described him as the reluctant reformer. Civil rights groups called him the calm in the storm. But he brushed it all aside. "I don't want a title," he told his staff. "I want a timeline." At home that night, Jalen sat at the dinner table staring at the TV coverage replaying his father's testimony. "You didn't flinch once," he said. Charles smiled faintly. "I couldn't afford to." Denise poured tea, her voice soft. "Neither of you could." In Greenville, the police department's old culture continued to unravel. Internal emails leaked showing how complaints had been rerouted, reports rewritten, citizens labeled hostile to justify stops. Each revelation drew another round of resignations. But out of the collapse came something new. Elena Ruiz, the former junior administrator now promoted to compliance officer, created a community review board that met in public, with citizens sitting beside officers. It was awkward at first, but it worked. Jalen started volunteering at those meetings when he wasn't studying. He listened more than he spoke, taking notes on how policies became practice. One evening, a middle-aged man who'd lost his job after a wrongful arrest asked, "You think they'll ever really change?" Jalen didn't answer immediately. "They have to," he said finally. "Because we're watching now." Weeks turned into months. The national attention faded as news stories took its place, but the impact remained. Training manuals were rewritten. Recruitment campaigns changed tone. For the first time, police academies invited community leaders to lecture on empathy and history. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress, and it had begun on a street where a boy had been told to stop walking. In the second winter after the incident, snow covered the sidewalks of Magnolia Street. Someone no one knew who had placed a single candle beneath the small plaque near the curb. Its light flickered in the cold air. Passing drivers slowed down to look. It stayed there for a week before the wind finally blew it out. Inside their home, the Lawsons kept moving forward. Denise returned to her classroom full-time. Charles continued drafting policy, each proposal less about punishment and more about prevention. And Jalen started college applications, his essay titled simply, "The Day I Learned the Law is Personal." One night, as Charles was leaving his office, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the Department of Justice. They wanted his input on a federal bill, one that would require every state to publicly release policing data. He read it twice, then smiled to himself. Quietly, he whispered, "About time." He didn't see it as victory. Just another step. The same kind of step his son had taken, one painful foot after another on that hot afternoon when the world finally decided to look. The trial began the following spring. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with tension. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, their microphones angled like arrows toward the courthouse steps. Protesters gathered behind the barricades, some demanding reform, others holding signs that read "Back the Blue." Every morning, as the courthouse doors opened, the chant of two Americas collided in the air. Inside, the courtroom was cold and deliberate. The walls seemed to absorb the weight of history. Keller entered first, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, followed by Mason, who kept his eyes down. Across the aisle sat Charles Lawson, not as a prosecutor, but as a father and witness. Jalen was beside him, older now, but the scar above his eyebrow still visible, a small, permanent reminder of the day that started it all. The state called its first witness, Laura Mitchelson, the teacher who had filmed everything. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. "He was just walking home," she said. "He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't even raise his voice." The defense attorney tried to undermine her credibility, suggesting she might have misinterpreted what she saw. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'm a teacher. I've spent 20 years learning to tell when a student is scared." He was terrified. Next came the video evidence. The jury watched the footage from 4 angles: the bystanders' phones, the dash cam, and the officer's own body cameras. Every shout, every grunt, every order was recorded. When Keller's voice played, "You don't look like you live there," the room went still. Even the defense attorney couldn't disguise his discomfort. Jalen was called to the stand on the 4th day. He walked slowly, deliberately, refusing help. He took his seat, looked at the jury, and spoke softly. "I didn't run because I didn't think I had to," he said. "I thought if I just did what they said, I'd be fine." He paused, searching for words. "I learned that sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough." The prosecutor nodded. "And what do you remember most from that day?" Jalen's answer came without hesitation. "The silence after I said my dad's name. Because that's when they realized I wasn't invisible anymore." It was the kind of line that lands not as a punch, but as a mirror. No one in the courtroom moved. When the defense tried to suggest that Keller had acted out of confusion, Charles stood as a rebuttal witness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. "Confusion," he said, "ends when a man is on the ground and you keep pressing." His tone carried more authority than any badge in that room. The verdict took only 6 hours. Keller was found guilty on both counts: assault under color of law and falsification of reports. Mason was convicted of aiding misconduct but avoided jail through a cooperation agreement. When the foreman read the verdict aloud, there was no cheer, no outburst, just a collective exhale. Outside, reporters surged forward. Charles stepped to the microphones. "This isn't about my family," he said. "It's about trust, the kind you can't rebuild with apologies, only with proof." Then he turned, placed a hand on Jalen's shoulder, and walked away. The trial sparked something larger than the sentence. Across the country, other victims came forward with videos, complaints, testimony. Some cited the Lawson case by name. Activists began calling it the Lawson precedent. Congress took notice. A bipartisan committee was formed to explore national accountability standards, and Charles was summoned again. This time not as a father, but as an expert. In Washington, he faced a panel of senators who alternated between sympathy and skepticism. One asked bluntly, "Aren't you afraid you're turning police work into a political job?" Charles leaned into the microphone. "It's already political," he said. "We just pretend it's not." The quote led the evening news. Within months, draft legislation circulated through committee halls: the Lawson Bill, designed to fund independent oversight agencies and make disciplinary data public. Civil rights groups hailed it as historic. Police unions called it interference. But for the first time, A real national debate had shifted from blame to blueprint. Back home, life moved slower. The media attention faded, replaced by new crises, new headlines. But in Greenville, change was visible. Patrol cars began carrying QR codes linking to transparency reports. A new program paired officers with community mentors. Elena Ruiz, now head of the local review board, sent Jalen an email with one line, "We finally got the training you wrote about." At the university, Jalen tried to stay out of the spotlight, but invitations kept coming to speak at schools, to appear on panels, to tell his story again and again. He agreed to some, refused others. "I don't want to be the face of pain," he told his mother. Denise smiled. "Then be the face of progress." He spoke once at a law school lecture where students asked if he forgave the officers. He thought for a long time before answering. "Forgiveness isn't for them," he said. "It's how I stopped carrying them." The audience didn't clap. They just listened. Meanwhile, Keller's appeal failed. He served his sentence quietly, taking part in mandatory bias and empathy courses that he once mocked. Guards later said he was polite, reserved, almost studious. When reporters requested an interview, he declined. "My words already hurt enough people," he wrote in a letter that was later leaked. "Now I'll let silence do its work." By the time he became eligible for parole, the world outside had changed. Departments across the country used Lawson training modules. The DOJ cited the case in its annual review of state reforms. The name that once symbolized outrage had become shorthand for reform done right. But to the Lawsons, it was still personal. Denise returned to volunteering at the local youth center, teaching teenagers how to interact with law enforcement safely, but also how to hold authority accountable. "You don't have to be powerless," she told them. "You just have to be prepared." Charles began mentoring young attorneys who wanted to enter public service. He told them what no textbook did, that justice wasn't an outcome. It was maintenance. "You fix one leak," he said, "another appears. But you keep fixing them because the alternative is rot." And Jalen. He finished his sophomore year, declared a double major in political science and criminal justice, and applied for an internship at the Attorney General's office, the same place where his father's crusade had begun. His application essay was a single sentence. "Sometimes the law needs witnesses more than it needs heroes." When Charles read it, he didn't say anything. He just folded the paper, slid it into his jacket, and told his secretary, "Make sure he gets in." The Lawson story had started on a stretch of pavement, but by now, it had become a network of New Beginnings officers learning empathy, lawmakers writing transparency into policy, and one family quietly proving that persistence can outlast outrage. And yet, for all the progress, the memory remained sharp. Some nights, Jalen still dreamed of that moment, the flash of red and blue, the sudden weight on his back, the confusion that felt endless. But he always woke up before the siren reached its peak, breathing steady, aware that he wasn't the same boy anymore. He once told a classmate, "That day took something from me. But it gave me something too, a reason." The classmate asked, "A reason for what?" Jalen thought about it and said, "To make sure nobody else needs a camera to be believed." The reform didn't come as a single law or grand speech. It arrived quietly, city by city, memo by memo, until it became impossible to ignore. Departments began posting disciplinary records online. Citizens learned how to request footage without red tape. The Lawson Act, what the press now called Charles Lawson's federal reform bill, passed with a slim majority after months of debate. Some said it went too far. Others said not far enough. Charles called it a beginning, not a banner. But beginnings have costs. The more the reform spread, the more enemies he made. Police unions staged walkouts. Political opponents accused him of undermining morale. One senator called him a bureaucrat with a personal vendetta. Charles didn't respond publicly, but his staff noticed he slept less, worked longer, and carried the weight of every new case file personally. At home, Denise tried to keep life normal. She cooked the same meals, kept the same Sunday routines, even insisted they still host their annual barbecue. But she could feel how the air in their house had changed. Jalen noticed too. "You look tired," he told his father one night. Charles smiled without humor. Justice has bad hours. By now, Jalen had become a symbol of the movement he never asked to lead. His social media inbox filled with messages from students, lawyers, and families who wanted to thank him or tell their own stories. Some sent photos, sons and daughters who'd made it home safely because an officer thought twice. Others sent apologies. Officers who said they had changed how they approached people. Jalen read them all, then deleted them. He didn't need to carry the internet's grief. Still, he carried its expectations. At university events, students quoted his courtroom testimony as if it were scripture. Journalists described him as the voice of a generation. He didn't feel like a voice. He felt like a kid still learning how to breathe without looking over his shoulder. One afternoon, he visited a high school assembly in a neighboring town. A teacher asked him to speak about accountability. He began nervously reading from notes, but then he looked up and saw rows of teenagers staring at him, some curious, some skeptical, all listening. They used to say time heals everything, he told them. But time doesn't heal what we don't fix. My dad didn't wait for time. He fixed what broke him. The auditorium erupted in quiet applause, not loud or forced, just genuine. Later that evening, Charles watched the clip online. He didn't call Jalen, didn't send a message. He simply sat back in his chair and whispered, "He gets it." At the same time, the National Reform Office that Charles had founded began releasing quarterly data. Each report told a complicated story. Excessive force complaints were down, but so were police recruitment numbers. Critics seized on the decline as proof that accountability had gone too far. "You've scared good cops away," one congressman accused him during a televised hearing. Charles leaned forward. "Good cops aren't scared of accountability. They're strengthened by it." The clip went viral again, sparking weeks of debate and millions of shares. Behind the scenes, the toll deepened. Denise's patience with politics frayed. She told him one night, "They'll never forgive you for making them look at themselves." Charles replied quietly, "They don't have to. They just have to look." At university, Jalen began working on a research project about community policing. He interviewed officers, citizens, reform advocates. His thesis argued that justice wasn't an institution, it was a conversation. "The system breaks," he wrote, "when people stop talking and start assuming." The paper earned top marks, but what mattered to him was a handwritten note from his professor. "You turned pain into blueprint." Spring came again, and with it, the second anniversary of the incident. The Lawsons returned to Magnolia Street for the first time as a family. The plaque was still there, surrounded by flowers left by strangers. Someone had tied a small blue ribbon next to it, a sign of respect from a local officer. Charles touched the edge of the metal plate, tracing the engraved words with his thumb. "It's smaller than I expected," he said. Denise smiled sadly. So was what started it. As they stood there, a patrol car slowed. The officer inside rolled down his window. "Mr. Lawson," he said, nervous but sincere, "I just wanted to say thank you. I joined because of what you did." "We needed this." Charles nodded once. "Then make it count." The car drove off, leaving silence behind. That evening, back home, the family sat on the porch as dusk settled. Jalen leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You ever think it'll stop being a story?" he asked. Charles shook his head. "It'll stop when it stops happening." Denise looked between them. "Then we keep telling it until it does." The next morning, Charles received a letter from the president inviting him to chair a new federal oversight task force. He hesitated before accepting. He knew it would mean another wave of scrutiny, another round of threats, but also another chance to institutionalize what had begun on a single street. "I'll do it," he said finally. "But we build it to outlive me." In the months that followed, that task force rewrote federal funding standards, tying grants to transparency and training benchmarks. Some states resisted. Others adopted the model outright. Slowly, measurable change began appearing in quarterly crime reports, lower use of force incidents, higher community trust indexes. The reforms weren't perfect, but they were real. Meanwhile, Keller's parole date approached. The press speculated whether Jalen would attend the hearing. He said nothing publicly. When asked by a classmate if he planned to forgive Keller, he replied, "Forgiveness isn't a performance. It's a decision, and I'm not done deciding." As spring turned to summer, Charles found himself once again on a stage, this time at a national policing conference. The hall was packed with chiefs, sheriffs, and cadets. He spoke without notes, his voice steady. "You can't build safety on fear," he said. "You can't demand respect while denying it. And you can't claim honor if silence protects the wrong side of the badge." The room stood in applause. Not all of them agreed, but they all listened. Afterward, a young cadet approached him. "Sir, I joined because of your son," he said. Charles smiled. Then never make another son your reason for regret. That night, as he drove home through the quiet streets of Raleigh, he passed a mural he hadn't seen before. It showed a boy walking under a streetlight, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes forward. Beneath it were the words, "Walk home safe." He pulled over, got out of the car, and stood in front of it for a long time. For once, he let himself feel what he'd avoided for 2 years: relief. Not victory, not closure, just the quiet sense that the world was finally, slowly, learning. When he got home, Jalen was sitting at the kitchen table, writing. "Another speech?" Charles asked. Jalen smiled. "A letter. To the next kid who gets stopped." He didn't look up as he wrote the first line. "You deserve to make it home." Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said softly, "Then make sure they do." By the 3rd year after the incident, the Lawson Act had become a benchmark. States that once resisted now quietly implemented its measures because the data spoke for itself. Fewer violent encounters, fewer complaints, fewer lawsuits. Insurance premiums for police departments dropped. City budgets finally reflected what Charles Lawson had said all along. Accountability wasn't anti-police. It was anti-failure, but with progress came backlash. Conservative talk shows called him the man dismantling law enforcement. Anonymous accounts flooded social media with edited clips portraying him as anti-American. At rallies, small groups carried signs reading "Lawson lies." Some of the rhetoric turned violent. Denise began checking the locks twice before bed. Charles refused to hide. "If I let fear decide, we go backward," he told her. She sighed. "Then promise me you'll come home every night." In one particularly tense week, a state legislature in the Midwest introduced a bill trying to override Lawson-style reforms. It failed after citizens showed up in droves to testify against it. One of them was a local police chief. "We were broken," he told the committee. "Lawson's model fixed us." That clip went viral, undoing weeks of political attacks in a single moment of honesty. Meanwhile, Jalen's name resurfaced in headlines when his university announced a new scholarship, the Lawson Fellowship for Justice, funded by private donors. Reporters asked him for comment, but he stayed silent. He wasn't chasing legacy, he was still building one quietly. His senior year research project focused on how storytelling could influence public trust. He found that the more departments shared honest footage, the more citizens cooperated. "Transparency isn't a weakness," he wrote. "It's an introduction." His professor sent the paper to a policy journal. It was published within months, cited in national debates. Charles framed the first copy. Then came the backlash that cut deeper than politics. One evening, while Charles was leaving a conference in Chicago, a protester approached shouting his name. Security moved fast, but not before someone threw a glass bottle that shattered at his feet. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. The resistance wasn't theoretical anymore. That night in the hotel, Denise called him. "Enough speeches," she said. "Let others carry it for a while." Charles stared out at the city lights. "If I stop, they win." She replied, "If you don't rest, you won't finish." He didn't answer. But when he returned home, he canceled 3 upcoming appearances and spent a week doing something he hadn't done in years: nothing. He cooked breakfast, sat on the porch, and listened. For the first time, he saw what Jalen saw when he looked at the world: a place that could still scare you but didn't have to own you. During that week, Keller's parole hearing was set. The press speculated endlessly. Would the Attorney General attend? Would his son? Jalen surprised everyone by announcing that he would testify not for revenge but for perspective. His statement was brief and calm. "You can't change what you refuse to face," he said to the board. If he understands that, then maybe freedom means something. Keller nodded silently, his eyes on the floor. The board granted parole. Outside, reporters tried to provoke a reaction. "Do you forgive him?" one asked. Jalen's answer was steady. "Forgiveness isn't about freeing him. It's about freeing me." The quote became the headline, shared millions of times. After the hearing, Keller disappeared from public view, moving to another state to work with a rehabilitation program for former officers. A year later, a quiet article appeared about his new life. The piece ended with his own words. "Accountability isn't punishment. It's correction. I learned that from the people I hurt." By then, Charles's reforms had reached every federal agency. Police cadets studied the Lawson case as required coursework. Training centers taught de-escalation by dialogue. Officers were graded on empathy as much as procedure. Critics called it soft. Citizens called it safer. Yet despite the progress, Charles knew how fragile it was. He reminded his staff daily, "The moment we call it finished, it breaks again." Then, one autumn evening while he was preparing notes for a town hall in Raleigh, Denise brought him a letter addressed simply to the father of change. Inside was a child's drawing, 2 stick figures, one large, one small, holding hands beneath a streetlight. The note read, "Thank you for helping my brother come home safe." There was no signature. Charles held it for a long time before placing it in his briefcase. Meanwhile, Jalen began his first job in public policy, working for a nonprofit that partnered with law enforcement on reform projects. His role wasn't glamorous, but it was tangible, drafting proposals, reviewing data, meeting families. He told a colleague, "We can't just fix systems. We have to rebuild trust one conversation at a time." At the same time, the national mood began to shift. The phrase, "walk home safe," became shorthand for reform that worked. Cities painted the words on sidewalks near schools and bus stops. Police cadets wore wristbands with the slogan during training. It wasn't a movement anymore, it was muscle memory. But even progress cast long shadows. The night before the 5th anniversary of the incident, Charles received a call from his deputy. An officer in another state had shot an unarmed teenager during a mistaken pursuit. The footage looked disturbingly familiar. For a moment, Charles closed his eyes, hearing echoes of the past. "Send me everything," he said. 2 days later, he was on a plane meeting with the victim's family. They were young, terrified, overwhelmed by attention. Charles didn't arrive with cameras or statements. He arrived with silence. "You don't know me," he said, "but I know this pain. You're not alone." The father looked at him and whispered, "I watched what you did for your son. Help us." Charles nodded. "We will." He called Jalen that night. "It's happening again," he said. Jalen's voice was calm. "Then we do what we always do, we start fixing it." The next morning, father and son stood together in another crowded press room. Flashbulbs popped. Questions flew, history threatened to repeat itself. But this time Charles didn't need to explain who he was. The reporters already knew, the system already knew, and that, more than any headline, proved that change had roots. After the briefing, they walked out side by side into the crisp autumn air. "You think it ever ends?" Jalen asked. Charles shook his head. "No, but it gets lighter when we carry it together." They stood for a moment under the gray sky, 2 silhouettes shaped by pain, but defined by purpose. And somewhere in cities they would never visit, strangers were walking home safely because of them. The 6th year after the incident began with quiet, not celebration. The Lawsons had learned that milestones weren't for fireworks. They were for reflection. The reforms had stabilized. The threats had faded and the country had moved on, at least, that's what the news cycle said. But at their kitchen table, they still talked about it as if it had been yesterday. Charles had just announced he wouldn't seek another term as Attorney General. His staff begged him to reconsider, but he'd already made peace with the decision. "The system's in motion," he said. "It doesn't need my face anymore." He had other plans, mentoring, consulting, teaching, perhaps. Denise supported the decision, though she knew he wasn't built for rest. Jalen had moved to Washington, D.C., working at a nonprofit that partnered with communities to implement the Lawson reforms on a local level. He lived in a small apartment with mismatched furniture and more books than space. On weekends, he volunteered at youth centers, telling kids that change wasn't a miracle, it was maintenance. "You have to show up for it," he told them. "Even when you're tired." Despite the progress, he carried invisible weight. Some nights he scrolled through old headlines, wondering if it had really changed anything or if the system was just better at pretending. When he told his father about those doubts, Charles replied, "If doubt keeps you honest, don't fight it. It means you're still paying attention." Then came the call that pulled him back home. Denise had fainted during a class. It wasn't serious, just exhaustion, but it reminded them all how much time had passed. When Jalen walked into the hospital room, she smiled weakly. "You're supposed to be saving the world," she teased. He laughed softly. "Not without you in it." Charles stood in the corner, silent but relieved. He'd seen too many emergencies to mistake this for anything simple. It was life telling him to slow down. After Denise recovered, they spent a week together as a family at the coast. No phones, no meetings, no press. The waves rolled steady against the shore, and for the first time in years, the air around them felt light. Jalen and Charles sat by the water one night, the horizon glowing orange. "You ever regret all of it?" Jalen asked. Charles thought for a moment. "Regret what?" "That it had to happen this way," Jalen said. Charles looked out toward the fading light. "I regret what it cost," he said, "but not what it built." A week later, back in Washington, a reporter requested an interview with Jalen for a documentary about the Lawson Act. He declined at first, then agreed under one condition: he would control the final edit. The interviewer asked him what it felt like to be a symbol. He answered plainly, "Symbols are shortcuts. I'm just a person who didn't stay quiet." The clip aired for 3 minutes on a Sunday night and reached millions of viewers. Letters poured in from all over the country, some from kids who wanted to study law, others from officers who said they'd changed how they wore their badge. At the same time, Charles was invited to teach a seminar at a major university. His first class filled instantly. Students expected fiery speeches, but what they got was a man who spoke softly, with the precision of someone who'd learned that volume and power weren't the same thing. He told them, "Policy is what you write when you realize pain has a paper trail." He made them debate both sides of every issue. When one student called his reforms too idealistic, Charles smiled. "Idealism is just realism before cynicism moves in," he said. Denise, back in her classroom, started a new elective ethics in action. Her students studied everyday courage, whistleblowers, teachers, nurses, and one particular case from their own town. She never used her husband's or son's names, but every student knew. One afternoon, a shy girl lingered after class and said, "Ms. Lawson, I used to think people like us couldn't change things." Denise smiled. "People like us are the only ones who ever do." By the time the 7th anniversary arrived, the Lawsons' lives had shifted from the center of a movement to the quiet edges of history. The reforms had become standard practice. Young officers entering the academy barely remembered a time before the Lawson Act. The once controversial phrase "walk home safe" had found its way into official mottos, but with progress came new challenges: automation, surveillance, digital profiling. Charles was often invited to advise on emerging civil rights issues. He would begin every meeting the same way. "Technology changes, bias doesn't. Fix the bias and the tools will follow." Meanwhile, Jalen began writing a book. It wasn't a memoir. It was a field guide, a series of essays and interviews with community leaders, parents, and officers trying to rebuild trust. The first chapter opened with a single sentence. It started with silence and ended with a conversation. He wrote it in longhand late at night, often with the same pen his father had used during his first hearing. One evening, after months apart, he visited home again. He found his father in the garden, trimming hedges with deliberate patience. "I turned down another committee job," Charles said. "They wanted me to lead a national task force on civil oversight." Jalen raised an eyebrow. "You're really done?" Charles nodded. "I built the bridge. Let others cross it." They sat together until the streetlights flicked on. Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out an old piece of paper creased and yellowing. "Remember this?" It was the statement Jalen had written years earlier for his college application. "Sometimes the law needs witnesses more than it needs heroes." Charles handed it to him. "I think the law got its witness." Jalen smiled, folding the paper carefully. "Maybe now it needs rest." But rest never came easy for any of them. A month later, Denise received an invitation for the family to attend the unveiling of a monument in Raleigh dedicated to victims of unlawful detentions. The base of the statue bore an inscription, "For those who spoke and for those who couldn't." At the ceremony, Charles gave a brief speech. "This isn't a memorial," he said. "It's a reminder. The day we stop being uncomfortable with injustice is the day we start repeating it." The crowd applauded, quiet but meaningful. In the front row, Jalen watched his father step down from the podium, knowing that every word carried years of cost. Later, when the cameras were gone, they stood together before the statue. Denise reached out and touched the cool bronze. "We survived it," she whispered. Charles replied softly. "We turned it into something bigger than us." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the monument cast 2 long shadows across the marble steps, one tall, one lean, stretching side by side until they vanished into the evening light. The 8th year after the incident began with a letter that came in the mail, addressed not to the Attorney General or the Reformer or even the family. It was handwritten, sent to Mr. Charles Lawson, citizen. The return address was a halfway house in Virginia. Inside the note was short, "Sir, I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know I've been working with a youth outreach program for released officers. We talk about choices, fear, and the moment between them. I tell them about the day I forgot what authority was supposed to mean. I've stopped wearing the badge, but I still serve. Brian Keller." Charles read it twice, then placed it in a drawer without comment. He didn't reply, but he didn't throw it away either. He told no one about the letter until months later when Jalen came home for Thanksgiving. Over coffee, Charles said quietly, "Keller wrote to me." Jalen didn't ask what it said. He just nodded. "You keep it?" Charles nodded back. "Yes." The silence between them wasn't tense anymore, it was peace. By now, Jalen's book had been published. Between Law and Life topped the non-fiction charts for weeks. He toured cities, universities, and police academies, not to preach but to listen. He told audiences, "We all live between law and life. The question isn't which side you're on. It's whether you know where you stand." His calm, unflinching tone made him a sought-after speaker. Young officers often approached him afterward, saying his words helped them see the badge differently. One evening, after a lecture in New York, he returned to his hotel room to find a message from a man named Thomas Avery, a police chief from Missouri. "Your father changed how I lead," it read. "You're changing how I think." Jalen stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Then teach someone else to change." Meanwhile, Charles had retired officially. The office he'd occupied for decades now belonged to someone else, though the walls still bore his framed ethics oath. He had moved his desk home, a smaller version of the one he'd used to rewrite state law. Sometimes he caught himself rereading old reports, not out of obsession but to remind himself how far they'd come. Denise encouraged him to start painting again, something he'd done in college before law school swallowed his time. He took it up slowly, painting mostly coastal scenes and city skylines. But one afternoon, Jalen noticed a half-finished canvas leaning against the wall. A single figure under a streetlight walking alone down a rain-slicked road. "That looks familiar," Jalen said. Charles smiled faintly. It should. The reforms had matured. Federal funding now tied directly to transparency metrics. Annual public reports listed both progress and failures by design. The country hadn't become perfect, but it had learned accountability like muscle memory. Charles was often invited to national conferences, though now he rarely accepted. When he did, he spoke less like a politician and more like a mentor. "Policy is scaffolding," he'd say. "It doesn't build the house. People do." Jalen, however, stepped into the national spotlight that his father had once filled. Networks invited him for commentary after every new case, every legislative milestone. He never dramatized, never raised his voice. "I'm not the story," he told interviewers. "The story is whether people feel safe enough to walk home." He started a foundation. The Lawson Initiative focused on mental health and legal education for teenagers who'd had early encounters with the justice system. The foundation worked with schools, community centers, and police departments to host workshops where kids could meet officers outside the context of fear. One of the officers who volunteered in the first pilot program was from Virginia. When the registration sheet came back, Jalen saw the name B. Keller. He didn't react. He just smiled quietly and approved the roster. Months later, at a regional conference for the foundation, Jalen met Keller for the first time since that day. There was no staged handshake, no cameras, no reporters, just two men standing in the same room after years of living on opposite sides of a single moment. Keller approached him slowly. "You don't have to say anything," he began. Jalen interrupted. "Then let's both listen." They talked privately for an hour about fear, about change, about the distance between who they were and who they'd become. When they parted, Keller said, "I can't undo it," Jalen replied. "You're not supposed to. Just don't repeat it." Neither spoke about the meeting publicly, but word of it spread quietly through reform circles, carried by those who needed to believe that progress didn't always need a headline. At home, Denise kept every article, every letter, every photo, but what she valued most were the moments that never made the news. The evenings when Jalen called just to ask how her class was going. The mornings Charles read the paper and smiled at a reform headline that didn't mention his name. The normalcy they had fought for had finally returned, though it carried scars they'd learned to wear like armor. On the 9th anniversary of the incident, Greenville held a small ceremony at the corner of Magnolia Street. The old plaque had been replaced by a larger monument, engraved with the names of community members who'd stood up that day: Laura Mitchelson, Tyrone Ellis, and others whose videos and courage had exposed the truth. The mayor, a younger man who'd grown up during the protests, gave a brief speech. "This corner changed our city. Let's make sure we keep changing with it." Charles and Denise stood quietly as Jalen spoke at the ceremony. "We live in a country that remembers its failures one headline at a time," he said. "But change isn't memory. It's maintenance. If this corner teaches anything, it's that doing nothing is never neutral." As the crowd applauded, Charles looked at his son not as a public figure, not as a symbol, but as a man who had taken the burden and reshaped it into purpose. He reached over and said softly, "You carried it well." Jalen smiled. "You handed it off better." That evening, as the family drove home, the city skyline glowed in the distance. Charles broke the silence. "You ever think about running for office?" Jalen laughed. "Not yet." "Good," Charles said, chuckling. "It'll ruin your sleep." Denise looked out the window, the lights reflecting in her eyes. "Maybe that's the point," she said quietly. "Some things shouldn't let us sleep easy." Back at home, Charles took out Keller's letter again. He read it slowly, folded it, and placed it beside a photo of Jalen taken the day of his graduation. The two pieces of paper, the confession and the achievement, sat side by side, symbols of the journey from damage to repair. He didn't frame them. Some stories don't belong behind glass. They belong in reach, as reminders. 10 years after the incident, Greenville looked different. The city had grown, but the corner of Magnolia Street stayed the same, a small patch of asphalt that had once held the weight of a nation's conscience. The monument gleamed in the sunlight. Flowers appeared there without fanfare. People stopped by, not to mourn, but to remember what accountability looked like when it stopped being theory. Charles Lawson stood at that corner once more, a decade older, his hair grayer, his movement slower but his eyes still sharp. Cameras were there again, but this time for something else: the dedication of the Lawson Center for Justice and Civic Education, a joint project between the state and local universities. He hadn't built it for himself. He'd built it for what came next. The governor introduced him as the man who turned outrage into order. But Charles smiled at that and shook his head. "Outrage is easy," he said when he took the podium. "Order is earned. Every rule, every reform, every change we celebrate today was paid for in sleepless nights and honest work. My family carried that weight. So did this city." He paused, looking toward Jalen and Denise in the front row. "We learned that justice doesn't retire. It just changes hands." The applause was gentle, sustained, human. No chants, no spectacle, just gratitude. After the ceremony, Jalen walked with his father along the edge of the street. "They're naming classrooms after you now," he said, half teasing. Charles smiled. "That's not for me. It's for the idea that got us here." Jalen had his own path now. The Lawson Initiative had expanded nationwide, helping thousands of students navigate the justice system, mentoring officers and advocating for victims' rights. He spent more time in community centers than on television, though his voice carried farther than ever. He'd become what his father once was, the calm voice in the storm. Denise, ever the teacher, ran the education program at the new center, designing workshops on civic courage. "Change," she told her students, "isn't just passing laws. It's deciding every day not to look away." Her class was always full. At home, their house had filled with small reminders of an extraordinary life. Framed headlines, plaques, notes from strangers. But on the living room wall hung only one photograph: Jalen, 17, smiling in his basketball uniform. Taken a week before that day, Charles once said, "That's the version of him I fight for." Denise replied, "And look what he became." One autumn evening, a storm rolled through Raleigh, thunder low and steady. Charles sat by the window, rereading Keller's letter one last time before slipping it into a folder marked private. He knew history would remember Keller as a villain, but he also knew the full story, that people could change, and that real reform was made of flawed men trying again. Later that night, he walked outside, breathing in the cool rain. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the sound of water running along the gutters. He thought of that summer day 10 years earlier, the flash of lights, the noise, the fear, and how from that chaos, something living had grown. He whispered into the dark, "We did all right, son." Inside, Jalen was on a video call with students from across the country, young activists discussing policy, reform, and fairness. One asked him, "How do you keep believing when it feels like nothing changes?" He smiled. "Because something always does," he said. "It might not be the world yet, but it's someone's world. That's enough for me." Months later, Charles announced his final public appearance, a retirement address at the university's law auditorium. The hall was packed. Cameras rolled, students stood in the aisles. He spoke for just 15 minutes, his voice calm, deliberate, reflective. "I've spent my life trying to make laws behave like people," he said. "Fair, kind, accountable. We got closer than I thought we could. But the truth is, the law isn't alive until you live it. Every generation has to feed it, water it, argue with it. Otherwise it dies quietly in the books." He paused, scanning the crowd. "My son taught me that justice is only real when it leaves the courtroom and walks home with you." When he stepped away from the podium, the audience rose. The ovation lasted long after he'd left the stage. At home, Denise found him later sitting in the garden, the night air cool against his skin. "You done talking to the world?" she asked softly. He smiled. "I think it's finally talking back." Years passed. The Lawson Center became a national model. Students came from everywhere to learn how to serve and reform at the same time. Keller's outreach program quietly merged with it without ceremony. The plaque from Magnolia Street was moved to the center's entrance, engraved with new words chosen by Jalen himself. "Power is not how loudly you speak, but how long you keep listening." And on quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low over Raleigh, the Lawsons sometimes drove by the old neighborhood. The streetlights came on one by one, steady and soft, like a promise kept. Jalen always slowed the car as they passed the corner. He didn't need to stop anymore. He just looked out the window, nodded once, and kept driving home. Stories like this don't end. They echo. From one family's pain came a blueprint for a nation. From one injustice came 1,000 acts of repair. Maybe that's the lesson: the world doesn't change all at once. It changes one walk home at a time. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in better days. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and walk home free.